What's up, folks? This is Justin Cussman here, just signing on to another conference, getting you guys started on your third assignment for this week. Going to show you how to do some stuff as far as page arrangement goes this week. I'm going to have you guys doing really the foundational kind of arrangement pieces this week, which are div tags. Div tags, which D-I-V, div tag, are kind of the foundational arrangement elements in HTML and CSS. And these are used to make kind of the actual bones of your page, like columns and things like that. We're going to be starting to get into things like that. So we're going to be doing some div tags this week. I'm going to have you guys doing some page styling using inline or on-page CSS, cascading style sheets, which we'll get into in a minute. So let's go and jump into it. The thing I want you to do this week is I'm going to have you guys make a mock-up 5-page website. The content of the website is totally up to you. I really don't care what that comprises. You can make that anything. Just make it sound kind of legitimate. Don't do too much jokey stuff. Try to get it to be something that would be portfolio worthy. The first thing that you want to do, though, this is something that's kind of background work that we haven't done a whole lot of. Anytime you do a website, and this is something I do at my job in Moto, when you do a website for a client, the very first step is a mock-up. Now, these can be called all kinds of different stuff. The low-end versions of these mock-ups, the very quick mock-ups that we'll do, like the one seen below here, is called a website wireframe. These can also be called paper prototypes if you get into user experience more. But this is very simple. This is just a very simple sketch of what you want the structure of this page to look like. It can be this loose. Just a very simple pencil sketch is all I'm looking for. The point of this is to get, ultimately, to get you and the client on the same page. Okay, that's the idea of this, is you create this mock-up very quickly, show it to the client to see if they found that acceptable and work from there. Okay, that's kind of the idea. Get used to making these little website wireframes. So I want you to knock out a little website wireframe. You will do a wireframe for every unique page of your site. So what does that mean? If the layout on your home page is the same as the layout on your about page, you don't need to do a new wireframe for it, right? I only need to see a mock-up of a page if it's a unique layout, if you change the layout from page to page, which you really shouldn't do too much. So it could be possible that you just have one wireframe and you're good with that. Just depends. The next stage, or this could be the first stage, depending on how you approach this. It doesn't really matter what order you do these in, is a sitemap. A sitemap is a simple flow chart. Okay, I just want to see how your site fits together. You land on the home page. From the home page, it branches out to these pages, which you can all get to from the home page, right? It's a simple flow chart. Now, for a 5-page website, a flow chart isn't all that necessary, but envision if you had 100 pages. You get more than 10 or 20 pages in a layout, and it's very difficult to figure out which page changed to what other page, which page you've completed, which page you've done pictures on. This can be like a checklist. So this is going to be a basic kind of a flow chart. So I want you guys to create these first, and you can just take pictures of them with your phone when you're done. And then you jump in to actually doing the page itself. Now, what I want this page is I want you to organize, mostly the exercise this week is to use div tags to organize your page with CSS, okay, which I'm going to show you how to do in a second. I want your content to have div tags. I want it to have titles, which pick background colors, put some text on there, change the color of the text, bold it out, do some different fonts, put some external links in there, put a nav bar up top, like I showed you last time. It's maybe a little more fancy with some CSS. Put an image on each page, okay? So how do we do all this? I'm going to show you the foundational kind of setup for divs here and how this works with CSS. So I'm just going to pull, this is the same website basic template that I had for last week here. So I just pulled this up. I'm going to do a little file save as, and this is in Dreamweaver. Remember, you don't have to use Dreamweaver. There are lots of free code editors out there, Adobe Brackets, Sublime Text. You don't have to use the Adobe suite for this. All of them work the same way. Okay, so you can use any code editor for this that you like. I'm going to save this into website 2. Index.html. Remember, your homepage is always named index.html. I'm also going to make a new folder for pictures. Just call it IMG and create that. And I'm going to save my index folder or index file right into the main folder. Okay, save that out. I'm updating my links. Okay, so yes, here we go. Now double check that I've got this in the correct folder. You always want to do that. Website 2, There we go, index.html. I'm gonna double click that to open that in a browser, or right click it and open with Chrome on this computer because it's being a little goofy. There we go. So remember, this is the one we made last week. All right, so let's say we want to take this really basic content and start doing layout arrangements for it. So the way we did this last week is not really the right way to approach page layout because we hadn't really gotten to CSS yet. So what we need here, close this real quick. What we need here is we need a arrangement of content on this page using specific tags. Right now, my code is all just kind of thrown onto my page. Okay, that's kind of an old school way of doing it. This is like 1997 web design right here. Now, once we get the basic bones of the HTML in there to control these pieces, to control all the bits and pieces that are in here, like the nav bar and this content and this picture, I need to start separating this out with div tags. Okay, so what are div tags? Div tags are simply this. Okay, you open and close a tag called div, which stands for divide. Okay, it's a page divide. These are supposed to be the organizational elements for your entire page. Now, the way this works is what you want to do is think of your web design in horizontal slices. Okay, so what I want to look at, let's say for instance, I was looking at a wireframe. Okay, and I wanted to do a layout similar to this, where I've got a header up top, I've got a nav bar that comes next, I've got a couple of sections for content that have some columns, and then a footer, right? This is the help of having a wireframe. Okay, so let's say I want to replicate something similar to this content. Each one of these sections, okay, if you look at this section here, this blog section, this horizontal slice, this piece that runs right through here is a div. It should be organized with a div, okay, a div tag. I'm going to call that div header. This section, the next slice down, this section here is also a div. That's where the nav goes, is in this div, this page divide. This section here, with all my content, is another div, okay? So it's wrapped. All of this content is wrapped in a div. Now, there will be smaller divs inside here. This is another div that comprises this chunk. This will be another div that contains this chunk. So what we're going to do is we're going to slice this thing up into pieces and look at the horizontal chunks to figure out how many divs we need. This is a div down at the bottom. So I can even count. I could even count on my page if I looked at this and say, I know right out of the gate, I need 1, 2, 3, 4 divs on my page, right? Because each horizontal slice is a div. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and set that up, and then I could subdivide that later for more content. Now, here's how we do it. The first thing you're going to do is just by starting with these basic div tags. Okay, the very first thing you want to do is take a div tag, start it as the first thing in your body. Here's a div tag. Close it after the last thing in your body. This div is going to be a wrapper. Okay, we could even tab out this content if we wanted to cascade this, start keeping things more arranged so I can see what this div comprises. But this is my wrapper div. Now, everything on my page, this is really important. The basic thing you want to do in HTML and CSS, the very first thing is create a wrapper div that surrounds everything on your page. That's div number 1. That is this page, okay? And that's going to come up here in a minute why I want to do this when we get to CSS in a second. All right, so my page is now divided up. And my first div is in there. Now, second div that I'm going to make is going to be for this stuff, the A tags. Remember, last week I told you your ahref stuff is going to go in, it's going to be your nav bar, and we're going to get into doing nav bars a little bit more next week. But this is your basic nav section. Okay, we want to split this up with a separate div. And you just do div, open and close. Okay, you just surround it. Paste this in here. Now I'm going to cascade this out so I know which pieces are surrounded. There we go. Now I've got a div that wraps my whole body. I've got a div that wraps my header. Okay, now later on we'll call this something specific. Sometimes you'll see this represented if you guys are Googling it as nav. Now we'll get into that later, how to do that. But this is the basics is using page divides. Okay. This content here is going to be another div. So I'm going to go div tag here, open div, close div. I'm going to copy and paste this div around this chunk of content, cascade it out. Okay. And then this image, why not? I'm going to have this image inside another div tag here, because I know I want to control that. Oops, I accidentally did a close div on that. Make sure I do an open div first, and then a close div around that picture. Okay. Now, again, this is the point of cascading. Sometimes you want to, again, make sure that your content, if you're using cascades, it's a lot easier to see what you're doing here. I can actually click on these divs and see what my divs surround. This div surrounds all my content. This div surrounds my nav. This is my text. This is my image. Okay. Now, I don't have a footer in there yet, but I'm going to add that later. But these are the basic page divides. Now, if I save this and refresh it in my browser, nothing happens. Okay. These page divides don't do anything by default. They're just placeholders. Okay. Now, what these are meant to do is accept CSS. Now, what is CSS? CSS is cascading style sheets. If you Google CSS, there's a lot of different CSS references and things out there that you can look at. But cascading style sheets are what we're talking about here. CSS is the language that controls HTML. Okay, HTML is the bones of your page. CSS is the flesh. CSS gets these bones to do something. Okay, they're like muscles and flesh. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set some basic CSS here to show you what these page divs do and how we can start controlling content on our page. Okay, now CSS can be implemented 3 different ways. This is really important. CSS can be inline, which I will show you first. CSS can be on page inside the head tag, and CSS can be off page completely in a whole separate page, which we'll do next week as an external style sheet. I'm going to show you 2 different ways, 2 old school ways of doing CSS, and each one has a hierarchy. Okay, the first way, I'm going to start with my wrapper div here. The first way you inject CSS into a web page, cascading style sheets to control something on a website, is by adding it after a tag. Okay, so this div tag, if I go to my V in div and hit space and put in a very important tag called style. Style equals quotation marks. This is the beginnings of CSS. Okay, anytime you see a style tag, that means we are applying cascading style sheets, which is a different style of lingo than HTML. Okay, which you're going to have to do some Googling to figure some of this out. But the CSS, what we're going to apply here, there's a lot of different forms of ways to address CSS. And I would recommend getting a CSS cheat sheet of some kind. I'm just Googling CSS cheat sheet because there's lots of these out there that show you all kinds of different codes, and there's code generators out there. Notice some of this stuff is what I'm going to be injecting into my CSS sheet here. These pseudo classes and things of this nature. There's all kinds of CSS sheets out there you can pull down and look at for all kinds of different things. Notice this one has just tons and tons of them on there. Okay, so this CSS comes in a couple of different flavors. The syntax, the way this works, I'm going to show you something very simple, like controlling the background color of a div. So inside our style tag, the way CSS works, what you do is you write, again, you're going to have to Google these things. Nobody memorizes all these. But let's say I want to change the background dash color of something. Now notice Dreamweaver is giving me shortcuts for this. A good code editing program will give you shortcuts to get to these things. Okay, so background dash color, that is an attribute of CSS. Okay, I want to change the style of this div, change the background color. Inside the quotes, you put colon. So you put the attribute, then colon, then what color? Let's say I want to use aqua. I can use verbose language like this. I could use hex language, which would be hashtag a color value. Okay, these are hexadecimal colors. If you Google hexadecimal colors, there are 3 different ways you can apply colors. You have the verbose colors, like I could just type in black. I could type in hexadecimal as this style, or I could do RGBA. There's lots of different ways to set color. Okay, if I do black like there. But this is the style. This is the CSS style. We have the attribute, and then the value for that attribute, and then a semicolon. Okay, so now in theory, if I've done this correctly, this wrapper that I've applied to my page should have a black background color. So if I go to my website, refresh, check it out. Okay, the wrapper I've applied to my page now has a background color. right? The text is still in there, and now my text is black on a black background color. Well, that's no good. That's hard to read. Let's apply another chunk of CSS, okay? This is interesting. So now remember, with HTML and CSS, this div tag surrounds everything. So that means this style is applying to everything inside these little bookends, right? The text is inside here. If I say color, background color is for the background of the page, color, colon, something, semicolon, sets the color of the text, okay? So I'm going to save that and refresh and check it out. Now, by default, any piece of text I put inside this div right here, okay, is a specific color. That is CSS. Cascading style sheets let you style the things inside here. Now, it gets much more complicated than this, and I'm going to show you something really important. Something called the CSS Box Model. So, the CSS Box Model is really important. The CSS Box Model shows you basically every property that a default div should have if you're trying to organize your page layout. And next week, we're going to get way more heavily into organizing your pages. Your page organization this week is going to be a little clunky. But what every div should have in it is a definition for width, a definition for height, a definition for padding, maybe border, margin, definitely. Okay, so all of these properties on a div should be filled out if you want to arrange the div on your page, which I want to do. Okay, for instance, if I go back into my div here, okay, and I apply a width property, width colon, I'm going to make this width 70%. Now, this is crazy important. With web design, I've mentioned this before with pictures. You can apply widths and heights and measurements in percentages, which is the way you should do it if you want your browser to be responsive. Remember, no matter what size the browser is, this will maintain 70% of it. Or I could set it in a specific pixel value, which is kind of old school design. Okay, we don't want to set specific pixel values because the ratios change depending on how big the browser is, whether it's on a phone, whether it's on a tablet, whether it's on a desktop. Okay, so percentages are for responsive web design. I'm going to save that, put a semicolon in there, save that. Now, if you watch, bingo, check it out. Now, all of the content on my page is 70% wide. No matter how wide my browser is, this stays, aha, look at that, responsive, 70%. So if it's on a phone, it'll stay this big. If it's on a tablet, it'll be this big, okay? Now, it's not centered, so I want to show you a really important centering element. This is very common. The most important, the way to center a div. Now, remember, this is all a div, a page divide, this whole wrapper, okay? I'm going to center it by using margin, auto, okay? That's an old school command, which means auto center the margins of this page. Check it out, okay? Margin auto centers things in HTML and CSS. Now this thing is centered in the middle of my page. It's 70% wide on a browser. I have these nice margins on the edges. That's how people do that, okay? My content is flush to the left, and this is going to illustrate margins and padding. So a really important thing, and this goes back to the CSS box model that everybody should know, is that margin is the space outside your div, okay? The outside of the div is your margin. The padding influences the content inside the div, okay? So that this is your div, the edge of the div, the margin's on the outside, the padding's on the inside. Just like in my browser, the margin is out here. I just set my margin to be auto. My width is 70%, so it's removing essentially 10% over here. Well, we'll do 15, but like removing some margin on each side. I want this text to not be so crammed on the edge. Basic design principles say that this needs some breathing room, some negative space. So I can add padding. Now, I can add padding in percentages or pixels. I'm going to just add it in pixels to show you what pixels look like. I'm going to add 80 pixels. Save. Bingo. Check this out. I now have 80 pixels of padding, okay, all the way around. So there's 40 on this side, 40 up top, 40 over here, 40 on the bottom. An important principle in CSS is when you add just a default property of margin or padding, it adds it all the way on all four sides of your div. It goes top, right, bottom left. And we can specify all these things if I wanted to. I could even do just padding dash left and just add padding to the left side, okay, of my object. Or padding dash, oh, makes it helps if you put the G in there. There we go. Now that this pixel padding is only on this side, padding dash left. Or I could do padding dash right, padding dash top, padding dash bottom. It can specify on any side, okay? But if you just leave it plain old padding, padding and margin are both like this, it will apply equally all the way around to your div, okay? Helps if you put the G back in. I keep erasing my G. Now, notice if you're spelling things wrong, it just ruins your code. It doesn't give you any errors. I keep forgetting to put that G in there, and it's just not applying my padding. If you don't spell things right in HTML and CSS, it's going to break. That's why I'm always saying copy and paste whenever humanly possible is a good idea. Okay, there we go. Check it out. Padding. This applies to every div. Okay, so what I've been doing here is adding inline CSS. Okay, I've been adding it. This is the old school way to do it. This is the strongest way to add CSS to something. This method of CSS overrides anything I'm going to do from here on in. This is the strongest method. Keep in mind, what I'm going to do next, okay, is set up an on-page CSS. This CSS, this chunk of CSS will override what I'm doing in a minute. This is a stronger value, a stronger hierarchy of CSS, and I'll come back to that, okay? Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply some things to my nav bar. Okay, I'm going to make some nav additions. How do you build a nav bar in HTML and CSS? This is how you do it, okay? So here's the other way to add CSS. Inside your head tag. Notice I went up inside my head tag. I'm going to add a style tag as the very last thing inside the head tag underneath everything else. That's very important. This we would use for media queries later on, adjusting things from mobile. This style tag will apply to all things on this page. This overrides the internal style tag. This style tag will override an external style sheet, okay? This will apply to whatever I want on my page. Now, I'm going to show you some stuff here. Basic HTML. If I want to style some basic HTML, I can do that, like the body of the page, okay? Basic HTML. If you're writing CSS, what you do to write CSS in this is kind of hacky CSS down here. What I'm doing is setting up CSS up top here in a style tag. I am saying I want the body of my page. Now, that is referencing this body tag. Anytime you're setting up CSS and there's only something, there's no dot or no hashtag up here, which I'll explain in a minute, that means this is applying to basic HTML tags like body, H1, any of these tagged P. I can put these inside my CSS, okay? What you do, you put the property in there, or whatever property you want to augment in here. Let me zoom in a little bit. Okay, body. And then you do curly brackets, okay? So the curly brackets, if you do shift and hit the bracket key, it creates curly brackets. These are CSS brackets, okay? This is the way that this is supposed to be written. Body, I would have, if I want to control paragraph elements, like my H1s down there, I could do H1, curly brackets, right? I'm setting up control for my CSS. This body tag is going to have some elements applied to it. Like if I want to change the background color to red or something ugly like that, this tag applies to the entire HTML document, right? Check it out. Now, I've got a very 1994 looking website here with very angel fire, which we're going to fix in a minute. But this is how you control this stuff. Now, notice the body of my page has a background color. We can apply a background picture to it. I can do all kinds of different stuff with this. This is now applying this body tag has the background color, the body of my page it's referencing. So the style sheet, anything in my HTML page, it's looking for this tag and saying, hey, I'm going to apply this style globally to anything that says body, okay? Like with H1, okay? So for instance, let's say if I have a couple of different H1 tags in here. I'm going to put two different H1 tags in here just to show you this, okay? Currently, my H1 tags, if I save this, I've got two of them in here. They're white. I've got home page and example, and they're a specific font, okay? The plus of this global style tag, again, this controls everything on the page, right? I can just say, hey, I want the color of all of my H1 tags to be green. This is going to be really ugly. But notice what it does. Instead of individually tagging each one, I could do H1 style equals color green, right? On each one of these H1 tags individually, if I wanted to be different colors. But let's say I want all of my H1 tags globally to be green. I do H1 color green inside a global style tag up here. And now all of my H1s, if I have 100 of these things, they turn green, okay? It's a faster way of changing stuff. Now, here's what's crazy. This is old school stuff, but this is very important to know. This is what I was just talking about, hierarchy, okay? You use this stuff to control the flesh and the muscles of your HTML bones here, right? I can still override these things, okay? They have a hierarchy. This tag is green, right? H1 homepage is green, right? But let's say in one, I want all of the ones I put in there to be green, except for in one single instance, I want this one to be red. So then you can still override it. I could still go H1, style, equals, quotation marks, color, red, semicolon, save. Now, this specific chunk, this one heading is a different style. Okay, so that's the point of these. You've got inline styles, you've got more global on-page styles, and we even have, which we'll do next week, external style sheets that we can control the entire website with, okay? This is the point of CSS. CSS is control for your HTML elements to style them, okay? Now, organizationally speaking, let's say, for instance, if I wanted to get this picture to sit next to this text, okay? I want to do some columns here, right? Here's how you do columns. This is going to introduce something new called, now you're going to have to Google some of this stuff to get a little more deep into it. We're going to look up Css Classes and Ids, okay? Classes and Ids. Now you should probably read about these a little bit. You can read about you can read on it lots of different places about IDs and classes and what the differences are with these things. 8-week class, we don't have a lot of time to break that down. Long story short, okay? Inside my style tag, I'm going to define a set of hashtag IDs. When you use a hashtag, it is a CSS ID, a div ID. Okay, these are used generally, hashtags and IDs are used for the bones of your page. The big things like hashtag nav is a standard structure. Okay, later on we'll talk about these a little more, standard HTML5. Suffice it to say, there in the new versions of HTML, there are standard structures. These standard pieces like the nav bar, the body of your page, we can do hashtag nav to create a reference. Okay, what does this mean? Hashtag nav. I'm going to do a couple things here. I'm going to define the width. What I'm doing right now is defining some values. The nav bar here. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is define the nav bar on my page. That's this chunk here. I'm going to do some styling for my nav bar. Okay, here's my hrefs. This is going to be the definitions for this div. Okay, right now I've got a width of 100. I'm going to do let's do background color. Just as something obvious and different, background color white. I'm going to do, now I could keep these all in line if I wanted to. I'm just doing the cascade on these to show you what CSS typically looks like. Margin auto to center it, okay? Maybe I want some padding in there. You should always define these values, width, height, background color, margin, padding. Give it some 10 pixels of padding just to see it. So these are all my values. This is the way CSS is set up. You do it line by line. Here's my attribute. Here's the value of this attribute. Attribute, value of the attribute. Okay, here's all the different things. This nav is going to have all these values. Now, to take all these values and apply them to my div, okay? So what I've got div. When I have a hashtag, it is an ID. So I go div ID equals. Okay, this is the only time you change the names of these things in CSS reference. ID means hashtag. If I were to set it up this way, I just want to show you the difference. This is a class, okay? This would be referenced if I did it this way, .nav instead of hashtag nav. .nav would be a class, And instead of ID right here, div ID, I would put div class. Okay, that's the only difference. The only difference, and we'll get into this later why we're doing it this way, but generally the bones are built this way for standard structures. These are used for augmenters to change things specifically. Okay, I'm gonna do something with this later. Okay, ID, div ID equals the name of the ID. Okay, nav. See, this is a short form. This sheet can be external or internal. Now it has taken all of these things, and instead of writing it long form, it has now applied these, and it's easier to see, a lot tidier. This stuff, if I refresh, is going to have all these properties. Okay. So if you look, I close it. Nope, here it is. Check it out. There's a nav bar. Okay. So that's the way you build a nav bar. You start building in these IDs, and it styles specifically each chunk of your page, right? So now I've got a wrapper. I've got a margin around this page. It's starting to look more legitimate. Okay, let's take this text and stick it beside this picture. Let me show you another important property. For instance, I'm going to go ahead and use this class, and I'm just going to call this, you can call classes and IDs anything you want. Okay, so I'm going to call this dot organize. You can call these anything you like. Okay, dot organize is going to be the class that I use to control these pieces here. Okay, so I'm going to do div class equals organize, right? To match the one up here. Classes are dots. Nav IDs are hashtags. Okay, I'm gonna have both of these be the same class just to show you a property. Now you could copy and paste, probably the smart way to do it. Now both of these classes have the same property up here. Now just to test it, I'm gonna add a background color. Now I would strongly recommend, this is the way you do this, is just test things before you do anything with them. I'm typing poorly today. Background color. Let's make this one, I just make them very obnoxious colors so that I can see if my HTML and CSS is working. Okay, now I can see that it's working. I'm gonna swap all this out for better colors later on if it were a real design. But go ahead and use obnoxious colors and big values when you first start so they can obviously see if this stuff is working or not. Okay, so I know I've got two columns. I've got two divs. I've got a div here, okay? I've got a div here. I want these two to sit side by side. How would I do that? Okay, they're both 100% width right now. You cannot get two things that are 100% wide to sit next to each other. 100 plus 100 is 200%, which doesn't exist in the real world, okay? So what I'm gonna do is give these things some more properties, like a width. I'm gonna make the width of these less than 50%, okay? Why am I making it less than 50%? Because everything total, if I have a width of 40% on these things, now these are 40% wide, okay? But I have no padding in here, right? One thing you gotta remember about HTML and CSS, the width of the page itself is cumulative, okay? If I have 40% and 40%, which are gonna sit side by side here in a minute with a property that I'm gonna add in, that's only 80%. I still want some room for padding and margin, okay? If I made these both 50%, they'd be crammed in here and I wouldn't have any breathing room. It would look stupid. So I need to leave a little bit of breathing room, 40% and 40%. Okay, they're not sitting side by side, but they will here in a second. How do I get them to sit side by side? Okay, one little property, float. There's actually several ways to do this. Now, the float inherit, float left, float none, float right. This is the way basic way. There are better ways and ways we'll get into later on of moving and placing columns in HTML is with float. Anything I tell to float left or right allows content below it. You think of this like a fish tank, right? If I tell this thing to float to the left, what's happening here? And let me put a semicolon here before I screw this up. Float left, look what happens. Okay, a couple things have happened here. This content here, this div, okay, that I've told, this dot organize, right, is applied to two different things. It's applied to this div here and this div here. This is allowing this div right here, 40%. This div that's 40% as well now floats up. It's like a fish tank. If everything's liquid and this thing is moved over, it allows this chunk to flop up. Now, it's thrown off our footer on our page, right? Right here, This is our footer. This is the background element that I've got. There's no height values set for any of this stuff. So it's assuming it can just chop in wherever it wants, okay? To do this correctly, I would assume some height values in here and put some more content in to block things off. I really don't want these two things to be the same div as well. Okay, that's also why they're colliding, is because these are both the same div, right? If I didn't want them to collide, I could then just change this down here to another div. Okay, instead of .organize, I could just copy and paste. Okay, and I could call this .organize2 or something of that nature. I could get rid of the float on that, save it. And now, again, both these things fit together, but I could also put in some other properties on this thing if I wanted to add some things in, like I clear out some different stuff on here if I wanted to. That didn't do anything right out of the gate. But I could add like different background colors and properties. Say if I wanted the background of this one to be, I don't know, I'm running out of colors here. Let's say blue, right? Now each one of these things will have a different, makes sense. Hopefully if you change the class, it helps if you actually swap out the class name here. Notice if I didn't change my class name, so nothing was happening here. Now, if I change the class name, these things have two different properties, right? So let me go ahead and put my float back in here. There we go. Okay, I'm going to pull out this clear. So float left, float right. Oops, let me get rid of my equal sign. I'm accidentally typing a lot of stuff in here I'm not supposed to. But now notice each one of these divs is now controllable, okay? Now, the reason the content down here is flopping up is because I don't have, not all of these divs have properties, okay? Like this background div that I've applied in here doesn't really have any properties in it, so everything's just kind of floating. I would want to put in more content. I'd want to put in a footer down here. I could define some height values. If I wanted both of these values to be the same, I could then say, hey, I want both of these divs to be, let's say 200 pixels for the height. Now, a word to the wise here. I was just saying widths need to be in percentages. Don't put heights in percentages, okay? Heights need to be in static pixel dimensions. Check this out. Now they're both 200 pixels tall, and they're even. Now, it doesn't encompass my content. I'm going to have to make sure my content makes sense. But if you're setting height values on stuff, it makes sense. Browsers resize from the bottom right-hand corner, okay? You don't want to define height values because pages are meant to scroll infinitely vertically along the y-axis here. So you don't want to define values in percentages because it doesn't make sense for the browser to be a percentage tall because it's going to be defined by the content itself. So generally, you want to leave height values out per se, okay? But this is the basics, though. This is really basically how it goes to organize your content. I could just keep blocking in stuff underneath this. Okay, if I want more content now, all I've got to do is take this div and paste it however many times I want, okay? If I paste this 3 or 4 times in there and save it, I now have 4 more rows of content, okay, is the idea. Or if I wanted to paste out literally the entire double chunk here, I could copy and paste out both of these columns and just replicate that 2-column layout all the way down, see? So now I've got 2-column layout, which is starting to look remarkably similar to this wireframe, right? So there we go. I've got my 2-column content here. I can even add in a 3rd column of divs here, and we'll do this later on. But I want you guys to stick with real basic layout here, okay? Real basic page layout here. I want you to get in there and try, again, don't worry too much about the organization. I want you to get in and try to do some styling with CSS. That's the big thing. Start looking up some CSS, get some CSS cheat sheets, find some good CSS online. You're going to need some references to this stuff, but try some inline CSS, some on-page CSS to try to get your 5-page website to look a little more organized. I'm going to warn you ahead of time. It's going to look a little bit like this, okay? It's going to look a little bit 1999 Angel Fire website, right? If you're old enough to remember that kind of stuff. If not, then you missed some fun things. But regardless, it's going to look a little janky. That's okay. Don't sweat it. The week after, we're going to get into the real control here. We're laying groundwork. So give me kind of a 5-page website. It's going to look a little screwy. Try to make it look pretty good. But the idea is to use some good CSS to control your HTML. And as always, if you have any questions, feel free to hit me up in that Teams link that I sent earlier on Canvas. Any place you need questions, I can do video chats with you, anything of that nature, let me know, and I can accommodate. As always, have a good week.